Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, it's a pleasure to take part in this debate about Part 2 of the Employment Relations Amendment Bill Number 2, the transitional provisions to such an innocuous-sounding bill. This is, of course, the Fire at Will Bill. That's how it's known in the streets, factories and workplaces of New Zealand, and quite rightly so. This is the piece of legislation that generalises the so-called pilot, which allows workers to be sacked without cause or without explanation in their first 90 days of employment, and it extends it to every single workplace in New Zealand. The Labour opposition is, of course, along with our colleagues in the Greens and others, fighting this every step of the way. And it is appropriate in the transitional provisions debate to ask what kind of workplaces and what kind of country this bill is a transition to. And I want to ask some specific questions about that. Is it a transition to an ethically based system of industrial and employment relations? No. What would an ethically based system look like? Well, arguably, an ethically based system would be one that respected the rights and individuals of all members of a company, whether they be directors or management or employees. And this bill, quite simply, does the opposite. This commoditises human beings. It treats human beings as commodities, as a factor of production alongside timber, bolts, oil, people. And people are not commodities, and they should not be treated like commodities. And the idea that a New Zealander could be sacked without so much as the dignity of an explanation of why, when it affects their entire future, not only their current earnings, not only their mortgage, but their opportunity to get another job in another place because they have to explain why they lost this one, that is not an ethical basis for law. And I say to this government...
Point of order, Joe Goodhue.
Mr Chair, I'm just wondering about the relevance to the part under debate.
It's a transitional provision, Mr Speaker.
Yeah, I'm listening, and you just inside the scope, but bring it in, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So let's now consider the economics of this transitional provision. Is this a transition, when this bill comes into a more productive workplace, certainly a less ethical workplace? Well, here history provides a guide. During the 1990s, there was a piece of legislation called the Employment Contracts Act, and that was, at the request of certain employer groups, designed to make labour markets more flexible. What could be wrong with that? Flexible meant easier to hire and fire and lower wage and labour costs. Now, the economics of the Employment Contracts Act have now been well documented, Mr Speaker. When the economy transitioned to that industrial law environment, labour productivity went down. Why did it go down? Because the cost of labour fell relative to the cost of capital. More workers, less tools equals less output per worker hour. And that is a key reason, sir, why in the 2000s the New Zealand economy is much less productive than for example, our Australian colleagues. And Mr English has, in question time, been debating with myself, Mr Anderton, Mr Parker and others, whether we are catching up to Australia or not. And I want to provide some data, care of the Honourable Jim Anderton, which is a combination of OECD, Australian Bureau of Statistics and New Zealand Department of Statistics numbers. Now, this is real GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, and it shows that in 1984 the gap between Australian and New Zealand workers was 13%. In 1990 it was 21%. In 1999, when Labour took office, it had grown to 34.2%. Extraordinary. By 2005, under the previous Labour-led government, it had actually dropped to 29.8%. It held steady at 29.8 to 2006. Here's the kicker. By 2009, it had increased to 36.1%, And in 2010, the gap between New Zealand and Australian incomes had risen to 37.4%. And I ask, how long will it be before it hits 40%? Nobody can argue we are catching up with Australia. We are going in the opposite direction. Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Cunliffe, I would caution the member, he's getting outside either the consequential amendment or the traditional.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your guidance on that. And so I've been trying to ask the question in this debate upon Part 2 of the innocuously sounding Employment Relations Amendment Bill, the Fire at Will Bill, what transition this bill implies for New Zealanders, for New Zealand workers who will be treated as commodities, for the New Zealand economy, which will have its labour productivity reduced as the incentive to use financial and technological capital goes down because commoditised workers are cheapened. And that is a nonsense economic strategy. We will never compete with the good old People's Republic of China on wage rates. They pay 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour. We pay a minimum wage of $13 an hour or thereabouts, and of course we want to see that rise. We want to be a high-value, high-income economy, one where people choose to migrate, where they choose to live, where they choose to give of their best brains and smarts and choose to build a better future. Not a sweatshop, not a transition to a banana republic. Because, Mr. Speaker, that is what this slope, this transition, and the junior whip, the soon-to-be former member for Rangitata, might sneer. But everybody knows this is a slippery, slippery slope. A slippery slope. And, Mr. Chairman, a transition to a productive industrial relations environment, that's the next question. And, Mr. Chairman, I would have thought that even members opposite would acknowledge that in fact New Zealand is very fortunate to have a union movement which is responsible, which is far-sighted, which takes the bigger picture, which looks for the win-wins. Gone are the days, although he had some redeeming virtues, of Jim Knox and the headbutting style of engagement. The New Zealand union movement wants to be partners, social partners, for a better future. And this government is taking that opportunity and rubbing their noses in the dirt and saying, swallow this. We won, you lost, your workers get it in the neck with 90 days, fire at will, no ifs, no buts, no explanation, down the road, bucko. And I just lament the stupidity of this move. I lament the lack of humanity of the move. I lament the lack of the most basic understanding of economics embedded in this move, and I lament, frankly, the short-sighted greed of employers who have lobbied for it and the lack of spine of a government that refused to stand up to it or perhaps believed it was the right thing to do. And, Mr. Speaker, transitional provisions are the time when we ask ourselves, transition to what future? What kind of future do we want for New Zealand? And all around the chamber, and those at home should be asking themselves, because we are at a critical time in the economic cycle and the political cycle, what sort of future do we want to transition to? Is it going to be an ecologically responsible, ethically based, technologically advanced, high-value economy where people choose to migrate to New Zealand, not away from it, where they are paid good wages and salaries because we are innovative, smart, make great products that people want to pay a premium for, and we have an international reputation as a premium brand that leads the world in our chosen market niches? Is it that kind of future which is clean, green, clever and wealthy, or is it the opposite? Is it a slippery slope to a banana republic where workers are paid pitifully by employers who can't see beyond the end of their nose? And here's the tragedy in this transition, Mr. Speaker. I think most employers are actually better than that. I think most employers would regard this as, well, kind of a sideshow. It's quite unnecessary, and that's the tragedy of it, sir, that the government has kowtowed to a few ideologues to put through a law which is bad for workers, bad for the country. And